Okay, welcome to a bit of bonus content for the break. So this is going to be all about feedback for your assessment 2 and then a bit of assessment 3. They kind of fit together. A lot of your assessment 2s, the mark for those are coming. So as you may remember, that as just after you submitted your assessment 2s, we went fully online, and I put a bit of a break on marking to make sure that all of my workshop leaders were focusing on actually delivering good content up until the break, not spending their time marking. They've all officially been off for the last 2 weeks, so I haven't been able to ask any of them to do any work. Some of them have opted to anyway, but officially none of them have worked for the last 2 weeks, so hopefully they start marking your assessment 2s next week. Hopefully you get them back, I don't know, the week after. So I understand that you want feedback, and I understand that it's going to come later this year because of unavoidable circumstances. So that's what this video is kind of all about, getting you some feedback for these assessments. It's not actually getting a feedback for your assessment 2 is not super important, to be honest. Most of the feedback that you're going to receive around assessment 2 is stuff that you will have already worked out for yourself, mainly by doing assessment 3. So it's not like you're at any huge disadvantage to not having it. And assessment 4 has a very different brief to what assessment 2 had, remember. So just because something was right or wrong necessarily for assessment 2 doesn't really mean that getting that feedback is going to be super useful for assessment 4. It's more you do the assessments and you learn by doing them, not by getting the feedback from them. That's the whole way this course is deliberately set up. So be aware some of the things that I'm going to point out today were things that were maybe correct for assessment 2, or maybe I'm pointing things out of this is how I expect you to do them in the future. This is all going to be my take on this. So with 10 different projects, all in different disciplines, everybody gets some discipline-specific content and a discipline-specific marker. So what I say here may be in contrast to what your marker has laid out for you, or your workshop leader's laid out for you. Remember, your own workshop leader is in general your marker, so anything they've told you overwrites anything that I'm going to tell you here. Okay, if they've explicitly said, I want to see you do a thing like this, go with them, they're marking, all right? We're going to be using a few examples here. So the way that this is going to run is I've got 2 example reports that I'm going to kind of go through and give you my thoughts on them blow by blow. And then I've got a bunch of slides where I highlight specific bits of feedback that were general across lots of fields that I want to give you. So the chances of these 2 reports being from your actual project are quite low, obviously. So you're going to have to spend a little bit of time as you get this content thinking, okay, which bits of this do actually apply to me and which bits don't. And a whole bunch of it's not going to apply to you. That's sort of just how this is. Sorry, I wish I could give you all one-on-one specific feedback for 2 hours each, but it's just not a reality, right? So yeah, you'll have to spend a bit of time going, okay, I can see how it's not specifically relevant, but I can interpret it. And this video might end up being fairly long, unfortunately. I think I'm probably looking at a solid hour, maybe hour and a half in order to get through all of this content. So it might be something, I'll timestamp it all for you and stuff like that, but maybe it's something you watch once in its entirety and then you really just go back and get the crucial bits out of it. A lot of this is going to be negative. So I'm predominantly going to be pointing out how people could have done better. Now, this is so that it's by pointing out things that we could have done better that we are able to improve. It's the most effective way for you to get this feedback is for it to be really, really negative feedback. That being said, a lot of the reports that you're going to see are people who've done reasonably well, or in fact, some of them quite well. So we want to be conscious that we're not doing this in order to, knock someone down a peg or have a go at anybody. We are just pointing out, hey, here's ways in which we could get better. Okay. Cool. All right. So I'll start by trying to take you right back to how I was when I very first started marking. So the first thing that I did when I started marking was I went to Blackboard and I downloaded every assessment 2 that had been submitted because I have no better way of sorting them than downloading them all. So I downloaded them all and I got a folder similar to the one that you've seen before, a big zip folder that I can open up and I can see unpack it, and then see all the people in here. And I had some subset of those that I needed to mark, as did every market, right? They were given a particular project to mark, or a particular workshop group to mark, or whatever. And so what you do in this scenario is you just come up to search, and you just type in name, colon, and now it's only searching the name, so it's only searching into this field. And you just put in the discipline that you're marking. So, I don't know, whatever. Name, let's say I'm marking civil today. Now, and then I get everybody who has the word civil within the name of their thing. So, as long as you named it correctly, you would have been sorted correctly, and this would have been easy. Where this can cause problems, though, is if you named your document incorrectly, no marker will have gotten you. You just would have sat there in the file, and you just wouldn't have been picked up. Not the responsibility of any of the markers if you didn't name your document correctly. And although eventually we'll probably go back and we will sort through all of these, it's going to happen right at the end. And I'd love to say that my markers would be in just as good of a mood at that stage as they are when they begin, but you know for a fact that's not going to be true, right? As far as I'm concerned, I've finished my marking. I've marked everybody who had education or teaching in their file name, so I'm done. So anybody who doesn't, yeah. So similar deal around getting your file format correctly. So getting your naming is really important to get your marker on side to begin with and help us, and then so is your file format. Because obviously these assessment 2s needed to be picked up and read by somebody else for assessment 3. So if you did a PDF, you made it a pain for everybody. So you may not understand why I've given you submission details. You don't need to understand. You just need to do it. Okay? It's not your job to understand it. It's your job to do the thing that you were told to do. And we're actually going to look into this PDF document. The reason why I picked this one is because this particular document's been done in a little bit of a weird way. There are some things to really like about this document, and there's a lot of stuff to really not like about it. Meaning this could have swung very easily to be quite a high mark or a clear fail, depending on how rigorously I decided as a marker to stick to the letter of my marking rubric. And if I was strict on it, this report's going to get smashed. However, there is a whole bunch of other really good things about it, so it's very much, you're going to find this open to the interpretation of the marker. And if you put them offside by doing a little thing wrong at the start, maybe you end up really just copying the rough end of this every single time. So, this report, we're going to go through this fairly slowly, and then we're going to go through a mechanical report after that one as well. And then we'll jump back to the PowerPoint slides. So page 1 is good. The title page has been filled out. It's been filled out correctly. Cool, good start. Next, we've got a table of contents for some reason. This was not required. This was a total waste of space. On an 8-page report, you do not need a table of contents. It's not relevant. Shouldn't have been here. Wasn't required. I told you it wasn't needed, and it took up a page. They dedicated a whole page to this that they so desperately need later on. It's also got the wrong font. This is not Times New Roman. This font is incorrect. So that's kind of the rough interpretation of it. On the other side, I could look at this and go, well, what have they done right? Although they didn't need a table of contents, this is correctly formatted table of contents. It is in the correct spot in a report. This is where it should go if you were to put one in. It's got a numbered list of headings with headings and then subheadings. This is all done really, really well. These are even, bigger, bolder text, and these are not. Like, that's excellent. And really, really cool. Page numbers in Roman numerals before the introduction, and then once we get into the introduction, they've restarted from 1 in Arabic. Like, just all of that's perfect. None of that is in my marking rubric, though, because it wasn't required. So, it's good, but are they earning any marks for it? We'll see. We'll see. So we come into an introduction now. This project requires designing a product to measure the heart rate when the body's ability to function properly is compromised. Kind of. The current constraints of the electrocardiogram are their size and mass. Not really. So let's do the good. So there's an introduction, and it's an introduction to the project, which is exactly what it should be. It's not an introduction to the document. No one cares. It's 8 pages long. They'll get over it. An introduction to the project. Good. Very good. ECG is a technical term. They're going to use it as an acronym. They've put it in full, and then they put the acronym in the brackets behind it the first time they used it. Nick, perfect. Absolutely the exact right thing to do. They are establishing the problem here. However, the current constraints of the we'll circle back to this. Continuing through here, they want to make a portable device in order for the design constraints to be met, which include not exceeding the product weight, fitting inside this particular size, costing this much, and transmitting wirelessly. Oh, awesome. So this is a scope, right? It's a bunch of bounds they've put around their project that they've put numbers to help scope it out. Excellent. Definitely the right thing to have done. Coding and hardware learning areas will act as a guide for students to fashion an ECG device. Cool. Awesome. Really good. Description of exactly what's happening. Not exactly what's happening in the project, but partially what's happening in the project. The one thing that this doesn't really include is what's this thing's job, what's it going to do, but that's actually contained in justification of the project. So it tells us that portable ECGs essential for measuring essential for immediate response, limiting the delay to medical assistance, cardiac arrest, and important to be able to have ECG monitors readily available. Sure, no enlargements, high blood pressure, or evidence of heart attacks are recognized. Okay. Kind of specific, but this is the thing's job. Really cool, really good background, and then an intro to Arduino. So all good. What's it missing? What's some bad things about this? The large size and mass is kind of an issue for the ECGs. It is for some of them, but there's a thing called the Holter monitor, which already exists and solves this problem. The problem's more cost than it is just size. It's more complicated than that. And so this in its entirety, it's just too short. It's just pretty much all too brief. This could have been all expanded out on to take up maybe 2 pages that would have been far better. So far better than having a table of contents would have been to spread this content out over 2 pages and do it in more detail and more correctly. The other thing that is definitely missing is references for this stuff. So I, as a reader, don't really agree with this. But it's not entirely wrong, but I don't think it's full. I don't really agree. Do you have a reference which backs you up? Because if you do, and you put it in there, well, I can then go and take my complaint up with the reference, but not with the author, right? So that would be some really good spots to put a reference. Same deal in here. This would be a really good spot to put a reference, because without it, you're just sort of spouting an opinion. And lots of people did this. They just spouted an opinion without a reference. And if your author doesn't, your reader doesn't agree, your marker doesn't agree, you're on real thin ice. Few little things getting into this. It's don't use contractions. So in a technical report, we generally try to avoid the use of contractions pretty much wherever possible. Really good thing to do in this case, if you are somebody who uses them a lot, and I am somebody who uses them all the time. So I just Control F, I search for and find quotation mark. And just find that for me. There we go. It's in bodies and it's in its. That one's perfectly fine. This one, I just separate that out to say it is. Is there any other in the document? No, there's not. Great. Perfect. Done. You can, with just that one little trick, find any use of a contraction that you may have used within your report, and you can just take it out. It is. Boom. Done. I know that's a little bit weird because it kind of flies in the face of you should shorten things and be as concise as possible, and yet you're not allowed to use contractions. I don't know why, but you're not. Yeah. Control Fing and searching for known issues is a great technique. Okay, so that's a little one. There's some up here as well, a bit of inconsistency. So product weight for portability, 20 kilos in brackets. And then fitting within this bound, no brackets go around these numbers and no brackets go around these numbers. So that's inconsistent, right? Well, what are you doing? Are you putting your numbers in brackets or are you not? Pick one, stick with it. Spaces between your numbers and your units. There should be a space there. There should be a space there. And that, I believe, is an X, and it probably should be a actual multiplication symbol. And here's an issue with the fact that we are in a PDF. So is this 12-point times New Roman font, and is that an X or is it a proper multiplication symbol? I don't know. I mean, it might be. Is that double spaced? I don't know. It might be. I have to grab this text, copy it, go, open a Word document. Hey, it looks like I've maybe tried this before. Paste it in, have a look. Okay, so it is 12-point times New Roman font, and it was double spaced. All of those things, they got them right, but you made a marker have to put effort into confirming them, and the more effort that your marker had to put into something like doing this, the less effort they've got left to go and try and find marks for you, right? So you're not wrong, but you're not helping yourself. And you probably didn't want to use X's here. You did use X's. You probably wanted to insert a symbol, multiplication symbol, so that you get that, right? It's not the same symbol. I don't know if you can see that on your monitors. Yeah, multiplication symbol instead of an X, all right? Don't use an X. And don't use an asterisk either. Use a multiplication symbol. In here. All right, cool beans. So that's that. I think that covers most of what we wanted to hit here. Again, we see our numbered headings. It's really good. Really like that. All right, moving on. Okay, so what comes up in the next couple of pages is what's essentially one big extended table, which has got all of the hardware described in it. There's a lot to like in this. So it's a table. It has a caption. The caption goes above, which is correct. It's the right font. It's the right size. It's the wrong color, but let's not worry too much about that. We've got figures. They've been captioned again correctly. This is all good. Light emitting diode, LED, done correctly. Excellent. And 5-volt pin. These units are actually formatted correctly this time. They've got the space, unlike up there. And a reference. Great. Lots and lots to like in here. And this has been done for all of these different bits of hardware throughout this process. Really good. Even in here, talking about LEDs, long leg is the cathode, short leg is the anode. This would be really helpful to somebody reading this for the first time. All of this stuff's really cool. The issue that we're going to hit with it is it's 3.5 pages long. And there was one, you could argue, 2 points in the marking rubric that could have been addressed that were addressing hardware, and that's it. So you spent 3 and a bit pages trying to get yourself maybe 1.5 marks. And there's heaps of white space here. There's heaps of just wasted space. That's wasted space. And look at things like this. That's all white space. This figure doesn't have to be that tall. You could have cut it off here and you could have made yourself more space. Same deal here, that you could have made a different size. Here, that could have been shorter. And these 3 points here, jumper wires, a USB cable, and a power bank. This is really simple hardware that you ended up spending an entire half a page on. It ends up costing you a lot of marks because of how dilute this information ended up being. Again, none of it's wrong, but it's really dilute. So, all right, moving into the next section. Technical learning areas acquired. Coding technical skills acquired in the duration of the project can be found in section 2.1. The hardware used to design the ECG is explored in 2.2. A summary of the WHS requirements in 2.3. This is awesome. I really, really like this. If you're going to lay out, these are the things that are in my document, this is really detailed, tells you exactly where they are, exactly where to look them up. That's cool. That I like. And it's only 3.5 lines long. We get into the software here, and again, it's a lack of introduction, and this hurt people consistently. If you've never coded before in your life and you come up to this is abrupt. So it's all correct. And what this actually is a list of dot points here about software, a list of dot points about basically tips and tricks for hardware and for OH&S. What these 2 pages would be really good for is it's effectively a cheat sheet. So if you've done a bit of coding and you're going into an environment where, all right, I'm going into a class, I need to do some coding or whatever, having these 2 pages with you as something you could refer back to really quickly and be like, oh, my code doesn't compile. Oh, that's right, I don't have semicolons in the right spot. That's what those things do. Really, really good. But this is like trying to teach somebody a spoken language by just teaching them how the grammar works. That's effectively all this is. There's no discussion, there's no explanation that goes with it. And I'm guessing that's just because they ran out of space. But you really need discussion of the way in which your software works and thinks for somebody who's never touched it before in their life. So that's a little bit of missing who your target audience is and missing a full description rather than just dot points of information. Now we get into the competency task. Effectively for this particular project was to build an ECG and to do some testing with it. Now, for those of you who don't know, this is what an ECG signal is supposed to look like. Kind of supposed to look like. So it's that standard thing you see in the movies where, you've got your heartbeat going beep, 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 beep before somebody flatlines. That's an ECG signal. That's about 10 to 15 seconds worth of ECG signal there. And each one of these big pulses is your heart contracting and an electrical impulse that's created as a function of that. There's a whole bunch more to it. Okay, so that's what I'm expecting to see. 15 seconds worth of data collected and presented here. If we read through this, what this figure is representing is 5 minutes of data. So effectively, it's just jammed all of that data into this really small space, and I can't read any of this. It just looks like random crap that was spattered at the screen. I can't tell whether this is actually working or not. And so then we've got this discussion of it here. Allows for a reading to be displayed. I don't know if it's a meaningful reading though. Observe the electrical signal of the heart. Not from what you've presented, I can't tell that. It's just splattered at the screen. And they talk about how environmental noise from surrounding EM radiation can get picked up and create noise. So none of this is wrong. And I know because I was in the room that, yes, they actually probably had this working and it probably is correct. But to an unknown reader looking at this, the data that's been presented does not allow for these conclusions to be drawn, and thus they're wrong because they can't be drawn from this particular data. So what this is really a message in is you got to put the time and effort into making your figures correctly so that they display the thing that they're supposed to display. And this doesn't. What it really needed to do was a whole bunch of going in depth, looking at the data, taking out different bits of it, really working hard on how you want to display that information. What you want to convey is your results and your outcomes are predominantly going to be conveyed through figures, not through words. So putting the effort into your figures is really, really important. Okay. We'll talk a bit more about formatting figures later, but actually what you decide to represent with your figure, super important. And then after this, we hit bibliography. It should be titled reference list, but whatever. References or reference list, either is fine. It is IEEE. They are good references. There are 5 of them. That's all fine. They could have done with more of them. If we remember back from the introduction, more would have been better. But, that's fine. Where this overall report really ends up lacking is there were things that just aren't in here. So there was a discipline-specific requirement for this particular project to include how the content learned could be taken into a schooling system and taught to 7 and 8 or 11 and 12 students. Not in here. There was supposed to be, probably I would have expected, photographs of the actual ECG itself set up there. I would have expected some content that talked about some of the other things that were programmed in the labs each week, and I would have expected content around how the logic of the code actually works using pseudocode or UML diagrams to illustrate how you took the ideas in your head and broke them down into code, because all of this stuff is incredibly important for a new person coming in. And it's just not there. And I can look at it in the negative light of because you were too lazy or you didn't know what was going on or whatever, bad, bad, bad. Or maybe it was just that you ran out of space. But irrespective, they were all things in the marking rubric to earn new marks that just aren't in here. And so if I stick to my rubric, this is a fail. It's definitely a fail. There's a whole bunch of stuff that's just flat out missing, and it's not like I can even look at it then and go, oh, well, you had a quick go at it here, you can get some of the marks. The heading's not there, you don't get the marks, you fail. But if we actually, just read this from start to finish, it is a report that's indicative of somebody who's done quite a lot of work. They've clearly put a fairly large amount of effort into the way in which they've laid it out. They've put a lot of thought into that. They've made an effort to make this easy for somebody else to read. Yeah, they've missed some stuff, but it's not fail quality work. And in fact, this person does reasonably well, but not according to the rubric that I wrote, according to the fact that I kind of binned my rubric to mark this person and said, all right, I'm just going to look at this and go, okay, well, you did all of these things well, despite the fact that they weren't in the rubric. For example, a discussion of OH&S. That wasn't in my rubric at all, but I opted to go, yeah, I see that as important, and I opted to overwrite some of my rubric things and give them a bit of a bonus here. One of the things to take away from this, though, is if you've got somebody who is going to rigorously stick to their rubric, you need to be looking at that and knowing, hey, I need to have a section on this, and I need to have a section on that. There was supposed to be 2 totally separate sections, one of them being effectiveness of ECG and one of them being your competency task. So you don't have a title for competency task, and that was worth 2 marks. So there goes 2 of your 10 marks straight away because you didn't have a section that was titled the right thing. Yeah, so it's just one of the points that I'm trying to highlight here is obviously the easier you can make it for your marker to give you marks, the more marks they're going to find for you. And every time you do something that makes it harder for them, like use the wrong file format or whatever, you're going to probably suffer as a result of that. All right, cool. So that's one. I'm going to jump out of here and jump into a different one now. So this is a mechanical project. And in this mechanical project, I wanted to get an example, which was the medical one, the education one, which is similar to the medical one, which was Arduino coding-based project. And then this one is a design and build project. So the Arduino project obviously works for the medicals, the robots, and to some extent the softwares. And this one being a design and build project is obviously more relevant to civils, chemicals, enviros, mechanicals, aeros, Red Bulls, that type of thing. So here we go. Here's our thing. We have another introduction starting at the beginning, looking through. This is again good. It's an introduction to the project, which is great. Permanent magnet generator, PMG, good. So they're explaining their acronyms and their technical terms. They've got some background in here. They've got a scoping statement, which they took directly from the brief. Now, this is dangerous. In general, I don't like it when somebody just takes a quote from somewhere else and dumps it in. my normal logic when marking is something that's a quote, I will not punish somebody for doing it, but I also won't reward them. So anything that's in quotation marks, I basically just skip over it and move on. So this doesn't earn you any points. It's not your scope, it's somebody else's that you dumped in. So that's my general approach to anything that's been quoted. So if you get a report and it's just quote, 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 I basically just skip over all of those things and you don't get any marks. This wasn't commonly done. It's just an interesting point. The kind of saving grace of this particular student is that there's not really a better way to write this than to just take it straight out of the design brief. The design brief has a scope written in it, and we hand it to in this particular project. It's a gift. There it is. There's the answer. So there is a little bit of interpretation that does need to be done to it, and they do that down here. I don't like that they directly repeated what was in the scope, but I don't think that was particularly great. So all in all here, yes, there's a scoping statement. It's not great, but it's okay. But hey, at least they tried a scoping statement. Loads of people didn't even bother, so that's good. Bit more scope in there. That's always good. They've put some background in here, which is good. So, passable, not great for an introduction. Some things that I'm not a huge fan of here, and I actually have the wrong version of this open. Don't save. I practiced this once before, and I made a few little changes, so here we go. Originally, these are size 20 point headings. There and there, and maybe not anywhere else, but at least in those two areas they are. It's a bit of overkill. They probably don't need to be 20. Hey, you probably could have gotten away with maybe 16. They're still clearly headings. That's when I opened this document the first time, they were 16s and they were still clearly headings. This heading here, it's the wrong font. 12, like that's probably perfectly fine. Maybe 14. Yeah, maybe 14. It was bold, underlined, and increased in size is probably overkill for a heading. And please be careful when you do put your headings in that you are conscious of your formatting. I do understand that some people deliberately wish to change their heading styles. I've told you you're not allowed to do that in these reports, so please be conscious of it. So that's all fine. All right, now we're going to get into some of the issues down here. Text wrapped, we never text wrap. All right, never text wrap your figures. It's not the way to do it. When you want to put a figure in, you just get a figure, you paste it in. You never play with these text wrapping options. Just leave them alone. All right. There are figure captions, but they're formatted wrong. So right click, insert caption, figure 1, whatever it is, arrows, stuff. It needs to say figure 1 in the caption, okay? And it also needs to be cross-referenced in the text. So somewhere in this text, it needs to say figure 1, and this doesn't. It does have a reference in there, which is nice. That's really cool. This had a reference as well, which was really good. I liked that. The other issue with this figure is it's way too small. So that text, lift, total reaction, and drag, that's really important that can be read by somebody. It's a really important figure. So you definitely want this big enough to be able to be read, okay? So, I'd be expecting this figure to be at least that big and to be centered, so, and not to be text wrapped. And that's how you want to have your figures laid out, okay? Not the way that one was. But other than that, we get in here, we've got some dot point summaries, which is pretty nice. A lot of this formatting has now been messed up. Again, if you're doing the text wrapping and stuff and you change anything in your document, it messes everything else up. It's why we don't ever do it, okay? Cool. Dot points, sub dot points. I like all of that. I like the use of references. I do like that you've got figures that go with all of the things that you're trying to explain. All of that's really cool. These types of things are very difficult to do with walls of text. Really easy to communicate with figures. So I like that you opted to use figures. I just don't like the way you formatted them, which isn't the end of the world. Again, down here, side-by-side figures that are too small, they can't be read, they should have been made to be multi-part figures. And again, that just seems to be the running theme here. Another issue that we get is in here. So equations, just like figures get their own kind of bit of space, so do equations. So this is an equation. It's done correctly. They've input an equation. They've inserted an equation, the correct way of doing it, which is awesome. You just got to give it its own line. Yeah. And then you generally center it. And you'll put an equation number on the right-hand side. And I've got an example of that later. But yeah, that's what you do for your equations, okay? Don't just leave them in line of text. So all of that's okay. It's the similar issues again and again here. All right. With these equations, we've got a discussion of assumptions and models. Yes, excellent. Really, really important. Everybody definitely needed to include this somewhere in their report, and lots of people didn't. Really important. And this is good. You're talking about efficiencies, which is a big part of the modeling in here, the bets limit. Really good discussion in here. So, big fan of this because it's super important. As an example, you talk about how in the wind here, there's 225 watts of power that can be extracted, but a reasonable turbine is never going to get any more than about 60 watts out of it. And so that's a huge difference, right? And somebody new to this game might not realize that as a function of some of the assumptions and models that are made in aerodynamics, that your maximum efficiency is really heavily capped. So really important, really well done, really good. To be a bit pedantic on you again here, though, looking at consistencies and inconsistencies in your equations. So that's not an equation, that's just text. This is an equation. Here you've used an X for multiplication, not a multiplication symbol, just an X. And here you've used an asterisk. Here, for some reason, you've put your watts in italics, and here you haven't put a space between your numbers and your units. Close, but just not correct. Okay, so this is a little bit of proofreading that was clearly missed at some stage here. So nothing in here is horribly wrong, but none of it's perfect either. Remember, in our equation editor, you put your multiplication symbol in, okay? Or even just in line of text, if for some reason you are doing this and you need to insert a symbol, you put your multiplication symbols in. So use them, and then just, copy them and paste them wherever they belong. So, yeah, please be conscious of that. Try to be consistent wherever you possibly can. Other than that, that's all okay. This is all okay. Same stuff we spoke about before. Little figures that are in the wrong spots, poorly formatted, but the use of figures is good. Cool. Again, same stuff we spoke about that. And then we have references. I'll talk about this twice. I'm going to use this exact example again in the slides, but I'd rather talk about it twice than not at all. So, references are in, they're IEEE references. There's 10 of them. All of these things are good. Faults with this referencing is your font got messed up on you. Again, just try to remember to come in and grab all of it and make everything times and make it all the right size and whatnot. Or you can, just Control A. So one of the reasons why I tell you everything in your document is meant to be Times New Roman, because it allows you to just Control A, Times New Roman, and then you're set, right? You don't have to worry about different things being different fonts and all this kind of junk. Everything's meant to be the same, so it makes it super easy to do this. Yeah, so that was one issue. The other issue is, now, personally, like, I don't care that you made a typo in my name. I couldn't care less. But some people in different circumstances definitely will. So in your first ever report you've ever submitted into engineering, I so don't care. But if it ever comes to the point where you're citing real journal articles and stuff like that, people will really care because your job as an academic is based on your number of citations. So it is, to some people, really important that you do get your citations right. Cool. All right, so that's this one. Again, it's fairly good. It's got a fair few issues with it and a lot of areas where it can be improved, but overall it's again quite good. So I guess that was to just very quickly take you through what's going through my mind as I'm sitting there and I'm marking people. So now I guess you've gotten to sit on the other side of the fence a little bit. What the remainder of this presentation and these slides are going to look like is just some things that I've noticed a lot of people making this type of error, and so I'm going to highlight some of these types of errors. So we've spoken about this quite a lot already, but I would say the first page of most reports that I've read so far was one of the weakest pages in the report, and it's the most important one. Particularly considering your target audience being somebody who knew less than you coming into this particular field, probably very unsure, very much somebody who was going to struggle to put all the pieces together. You really needed a solid introduction, solid first 1 or 2 pages to introduce the problem and everything you've done in the background. And in general, people did poor jobs of that. What you saw were 2 relatively good introductions to problems. Most of them were done far worse than that. Most of them just had an introduction to the document and no introduction to the actual problem itself, and that's just terrible. So, yeah, you don't need an introduction to the document. And if you were to put one in, I'm going to go slightly off script here, and I'm going to see if I'll show you something. So in a paper, this is a paper that I'm proving for somebody at the moment. Introduction. It's straight into, here's the background of the technical information. Extreme environment industry and constantly in need of high-performing materials, which It's the project, right? So they talk about the background, the science that you need to understand in order to understand the rest of this report, which is all really good stuff to put in an intro. And if you looked at any of the examples that I threw up for you in the Week 6 folder, not the Week 6 lecture, I put a bunch of examples up in the folder, remember, that you could have gone and had a look at. You would have seen that all of them ran more or less like this. Heaps of intro here. This is still a draft, so there's still stuff to work on, but that's all fine. Here. Right at the end of the intro, just before we get into the method, this work reports on the conditions under which tungsten forms a solid solution with moly, aluminium chloride, pressureless reactive sintering, blah, 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 blah. There it is. That's where that little bit of intro to what's in the rest of this document actually comes in, at the end of the introduction, not at the start. So if you did want to put one in, that's generally in a paper where it goes. And that's sort of what we saw in the PDF, in this PDF version as well, right? They gave an introduction to the problem, some background knowledge, and then they laid out how the rest of their report was going to go. So that was cool. All right. So that was that one. That's this one. The other thing is, in general, your scoping statements were weak. They weren't detailed enough. They didn't have enough numbers to them. There was huge parts of them that were missing. It was not super important for assessment 2. It's really important for assessment 4 that you've got a really good scope. Okay, introduction and project description and scope really need to be done concisely and well in assessment 4. We will specifically be looking for that. If you don't remember what's meant to be in a scope, go back to lecture 3. It tells you in there. Here's a fairly good example that I pulled out. Just this one was ChemEng. It does have an introduction to the document here, but I don't mind this introduction to the document. It's short. And it basically states, as you have attended all N1500 lectures but not the detailed workshops, here is a summary of the theory presented weeks 1 to 3. The following information is designed to quickly bring you up to speed, providing you with background information that will enable you to become a valuable team member. This is basically a set of assumptions about the reader. And I kind of like that. It's like, I assume you are this particular person, and the document has been created as such. I don't mind that. And it's short. It's only 4 lines long. Good. Good background here, though. Talks about Fiji, talks about how it's an island nation, gives numbers to this. This is excellent. Talks about why it's a problem, that they have a lot of rain, but no, they don't have areas to hold it. Excellent. Then we get into a scope as well, and it's got specifically $100 budget, Fijian household, fresh drinking water, 100 devices will be made. Really, really good. 1 meter cubed box, under 50 kilos. They put numbers in it. So this is really, really cool. It's still probably missing some little bits and pieces like timelines and things like that. Maybe the size of your team. Some of those things were probably assumed though. So there's a good example. Project brief. Here's not so good of an example. So this person starts out okay talking about their project brief. This is the robot project, the autonomous vehicle. It must take input data from the sensors and use it to make decisions. Kind of. Okay. An ultrasonic sensor will be used to determine the distance the vehicle is from walls. That's super not part of the project brief. That's a decision that you made. You get given several different sensors which can determine distance, none of which necessarily need to be used, but this is where it starts to really go off the rails. We now get like 5 lines of description about how an ultrasonic sensor works. None of that is project brief. That's background information maybe, or that's specifically, here's how this one piece of hardware works. But it's not project brief at all. And then we get into the infrared sensor is attached to the front of the vehicle. The sensor emits infrared radiation and measures the return based on this 0 or 1. The vehicle will be configured such that it will return to the black if it does not detect the infrared sensor. Not project brief. Again, it's not wrong. Both of these descriptions are correct, but they're in the wrong spot, and so you're not getting any points for project brief, and you're not getting any points for introducing hardware because you did it in the wrong spot. Okay? So what this reads to me as somebody did this as a first draft, realized as they started writing about ultrasonic sensors that they should put all this information in, but they clearly missed part of their planning step right at the beginning, and they didn't plan this out particularly well. And then when they did their revising, they never identified that this is in totally the wrong spot, but it's in totally the wrong spot. Okay. Cool. I'm going to harp on about figures for a while here. Some of this stuff is things that I know you will have learnt this between when you submitted your 2A report and now, but I'm going to address it to make sure that everybody kind of knows it. Okay? Alright, so this was really interesting. In one report, you're going to see this and then the next slide. It's from the same report, and there's it's this weird combination of how figures were done within this report. So the first figure that went in, figure 1, it's done really, really well. It's a figure, it's QRS complex, so ECG wave again. It's a figure, it's centered, it's not text-wrapped, it has a caption, the caption's got a description to go with it, it's referenced in the text. There's a lot to like here, right? If I was being nasty, it probably should have been a little bit bigger than it was, and it should have had a reference attached to it. But other than that, this is a really, really good figure. It's ticked all the boxes. Same report, 2 pages later. This starts to kind of go off the rails now. So, pardon me, figure 3. Still got a caption, but it's above for some reason now. Not quite sure why. They've attempted to label a whole bunch of parts of an Arduino board, which conceptually is fine, but their figure is well and truly outside of their margins. Well, it's inside of the margins, it's outside of the acceptable size, so all of this would have gotten cut off in a printing process. So that's pretty unacceptable. We get inconsistencies, 3.3 little volts and 5 big volts. Yeah. But we get a description here. So this is normal body text. It references figure 3. That's all good. Cool. Now it hits figure 4 and 5. So, for figure 3, the only things that are really wrong with it is the figure captions above, and it was too big. It went into the margins when it should have. Figure 4 and 5, our style totally changes again here. This is weird. We get a caption below, and then we get all this text above, and it's like maybe being put in a text box and attached to the figure, but it should have just been body text. Or did we switch to 2-column format here? I don't know. And this text box isn't really in an appropriate spot. So the figure caption needs to go below everything, not beside it. And our font is now wrong, right? This is the wrong font. So I don't know how these figures came to be, but they're different. Then we come to figure 6, and it's different again. It doesn't get a description to go with it anywhere. There's no description. There's these two text boxes, which probably tell us all the information that we maybe needed to get, but yeah, there's no descriptive text around it. It looks like maybe they've tried to center it by using a bunch of spaces. I think that's what they were aiming to do here. What would have made your life so much easier was go to PowerPoint, assemble these things the way you want them in PowerPoint with your labels and all of that, and then save that slide as a single image, and then just import that image into your document. It's so much easier. Figure 7, we go back to a slightly different style again. We get this bit of chunk of text, but it's going to talk about figure 7 and figure 8 together, whereas they were separate here. This should have been figure 7 parts A and B, a fully assembled thing, and then the LED. And then figure 9's formatted differently again. I guess figure 9's formatted like that. There's like 4 different ways of formatting figures across 2 pages. So not only are a bunch of these not the right way to do it, they're inconsistent. If you're going to do something, pick a style and stick with it, okay? Another thing that we saw that people got wrong a lot, we spoke about this already, is never text wrap your figures, all right? They get their own line, they get white space either side of them. Don't do this. And make sure they're a readable size. Make sure it's big enough for this text to be able to be read, okay? And make sure the captions go below. Same deal with the equation. So we spoke about that when we actually marked this report. So captioning figures is supposed to be really easy, right? So you just copy a figure, paste it into your document. Never touch the text wrapping, never insert a text box. Right-click on the figure, insert caption. Done. That should be it. If you do that, your whole document will hold together at all times. You'll never get that meme scenario of I moved a figure 1 millimeter to the left and my whole document exploded. Like, if that's happening, it's because you're doing it wrong, okay? Copy them in, paste them, insert a caption. Be aware the captions will probably come out with whatever style Word has got for captions, and you will need to change it, which this particular author has already reformatted it so that it formats the way that they wanted it to format. Okay. If you do want to make a complicated figure with multiple parts to it, with text boxes and all of that type of stuff, make it in PowerPoint first and then just straight up dump it into Word. Okay? The only bit of editing that I ever do inside of Word is cropping. And I do it inside of PowerPoint all the time as well. Picture tools, crop, I don't want that. Or maybe I only wanted to show half the figure. And you can crop it in. All right. So that might be an acceptable thing to do within Word or whatever. But that's the only bit of editing I'd pretty much ever do to a figure in Word is crop it and change its size. So you can also make sure that all of your figures, if you want, are exactly the same size, which is a really nice thing to do without a document. Make sure they're all the same size. Makes readability just way easier. All right. Another thing, again, we've touched on this before when we spoke about this one. It's putting some effort into your figures to making sure that they are as readable and as informative as possible. So, stealing from the Civil Structures project now, looking at 2 people who have done made a truss in a simulations package, which is great. Now, normally when you're using the package and you look at the screen, it looks roughly like this image here. It gives you the thing that you're modeling, and then it puts a scale up in the top left-hand corner. Now, if this image is filling your entire screen, that scale is very readable, and it's all hunky-dory. But once you take this, scale it right down to fit it within your document and paste it in, this scale becomes totally unreadable, right? So I can't read what any of those numbers are, even on my 34-inch super 4K ultra widescreen monitor. I still can't read that stuff. Printed in a document, I have no hope. What this person's done on the left is a really good job where they've taken a zoomed in image here and they've attached these two things together. So I've got a readable scale bar. This is such a good way of representing data, contrasted to this, which is such a difficult way of representing data. Out of interest for you, if you are in the civil project, and this sort of goes for everybody, the program uses a black background by default. It's standard night mode stuff. You can change that to be a white background, because when you try and print this has got to print black ink absolutely everywhere, and it really wrecks readability on the other side of the page and stuff like that. So again, think it through. It was fine as a electronic version, but as a printed version, you'd really want to change this background to be white. It just makes a lot more sense. We spoke about this already, just to re-highlight on it for anybody who's maybe skipping through. You want to spend a fair bit of time figuring out which figures convey the most information to your target audience as possible, and you will probably spend many hours preparing your figures, going through your data and going, all right, what 1 or 10 seconds of this 5 minutes of data do I actually want to extract and show the reader, so that I can convey information as well as possible. Text that goes with, well, pretty much anything, always pales in comparison to the figure itself. So you can talk about this as much as you want with text. None of it conveys as much weight, and thus none of it will earn you as much marks as the figure itself does. Okay? Cool. So another part that was done, and I do acknowledge that in the first assessment, it was probably the first time you'd put a lot of figures in. And yeah, a lot of them were rough as a result. But for your next assessment, and definitely for your final ones, figures are going to be super important. So I do want you to know that. Same with models and assumptions. You're going to be asked about models and assumptions in every single submission that you make. So learn what the hell we're talking about and put some effort into doing them well. All right? They're going to constantly crop up. It's a huge deal in these projects that you know how to do these things well. So here's an example of somebody who had a crack at models and assumptions in not a great way. So it's an attempt, but it's not a particularly good one. Although, whilst reading this report, if I read this and then I read the competency task, it became very obvious that these were done retrospectively. So these were written after the competency task was written. So when starting the project, some assumptions we made, this is the robot project, so a little bot that's got to drive around autonomously, were made to simplify the construction and coding of the robot. These assumptions include flat level ground and walls, consistent light levels, and motors run at the same speed. Based off these, the task description for the competency, blah, 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 they wrote the code. And when you read their competency area, they find out that every one of these assumptions was totally wrong. And that's kind of how I know they were written retrospectively. But that's fine. So this is an attempt at some models and assumptions. The thing is, there's a whole lot more than these three. And if you want to do well at your project, you're going to have to be aware of all of the other ones. So I'm hoping that you would get the opportunity maybe for your next submission to think about maybe some other assumptions that you are making that you maybe have or haven't proven yet that are going to be important. All right, different example. This is the civil project, water tower. As referred to in the week 2 lecture with Dylan, the assumptions that have been made relating to our civil project is that gravity is equal to 9.8 meters per second, should have been in space. The model of our joint and drilling holes into our material, the weight of water as 18.0150 grams per mole, Put a space in there, which is nice. And the type of environment that our design will be subject to. All right, so these are 4 assumptions or models that they're going to talk about. What I want to tease apart in this example is a good assumption or a solid assumption that you're like, okay, you can argue it's an assumption because everything's an assumption, but we know it really accurately, versus, yeah, we kind of guessed that, and we're just crossing our fingers and hoping. So gravity is equal to 9.81. You know that's accurate to within 9.80 or 9.81. You know that's accurate to within about 1%, 2%. The weight of water in grams per mole, in the absence of heavy hydrogen, that's going to be accurate to within much better than 1%. So yeah, you can argue that these things are both assumptions, but you know them very, very accurately. The strength of a piece of wood or whatever, once you drill a hole in it to make a joint that you probably drilled slightly crooked and maybe a little bit too close to the edge, you have no idea how much that's going to affect your model. And you have your analysis of your structure, and you have no way of getting an accurate number for that. The type of environment that our design will be subject to, you also have no real idea. The design brief's written in such a way that it's like, it'll probably be outside. What does that mean? It'll have use case loads on it. And we don't define use case loads any more than that. And so that could be a whole bunch of different things, like somebody knocking into it or a kid trying to climb up the side of it. So it's just kind of teasing these things out a little bit and going, okay, these are maybe some ones that we're quite happy with, and these are some ones where we're making big, bold, sweeping assumptions. And we're going to state to you, okay, we are going to design for this and we're not going to design for that. But we understand that this was just all but a guess, basically. All right, so yeah, what are solid assumptions and what are big simplifications? Really important section. It's going to come up a lot, and it would be really important for a new person coming in and trying to understand these things. Okay, so in terms of target audience, discussion of the models and assumptions is really, really important so they can understand the field in which they're working. All right, so again, you'll get an opportunity to do that again in Assessment 4 and Assessment 6 and whatnot. Okay, let's talk about units for a little while. I'm going to get a little bit pedantic here, so this was an example that I found that kind of has everything in it. Some of this is done quite well and some of it not so much. So in terms of units. So this bit of text, the joule, capital J, is defined as a force of 1 Newton acting over 1 meter is the measurement of energy. The joule is defined as a force. Is the measurement. Okay, something wrong with the grammar there, but whatever, who cares? It makes sense. It is possible to define how much energy is required to heat 1 gram of water by 1 degree Celsius, as James Prescott Joule demonstrated. It required 4,184 joules of work. No, it didn't. This is known as specific heat capacity of water. This is out by a factor of 1,000. Either you meant 1 kilogram of water or you meant 4.184 joules of water. Either, whatever. Okay, so putting my pedantic hat on and going through this. Some of this is done incredibly well. So the joule, as a unit of measurement, spelt out in full, is not capitalized. Correct. As an abbreviation, is capitalized because it's named after a person, joule, spelt out in full, but now naming the person, so it is capitalized. Correct. So that, and that is perfect. Good. And then you didn't put a space between meters and the 1 and the newtons. I think you just missed it because you did put a space here. But this again is correct. Capital N for Newton and spelling out the whole name of the unit. Lowercase, correct, perfect. But why did you write joule as a full word and then put J in brackets? And here you put Newton out of the brackets and the full word in the brackets. It's just inconsistent, right? Pick one, stick with it. Yep, that was all fine. Yeah, there was a typo here. You either meant 1 kilogram or 4.184 for joules of, I wouldn't say joules of work, I would say joules of energy. A joule is a measurement of energy, so I'd say joules of energy. But other than that, this looks pretty good. Okay, so a few things that were wrong here is we missed a space here. That's the other thing that's wrong here. So 1 gram, so using the abbreviations there, you should be using the abbreviation here as well. You don't mix full names of units and abbreviations, okay? So you one or the other. You get it right. And joules of energy. So, yeah, we missed the space there. We got this a little bit wrong. But other than that, this is pretty good. I think this is actually the same person. Also does a really nice job of their equations. So full spelt out equation with multiplication symbols in it and an equation number that's been right aligned. Like that's schmick. That's perfect. Fully defining their masses, their specific heat capacities. Here they've used 4.184 joules per gram per degree. So I imagine they just missed a full decimal point there. Yeah, equation 1, equation 2. That's perfect. That's as good as I'd ever ask anybody to lay their first assessment task of equations out. Contrary to that, bit of a different example here. This is another screenshot from a different report. This would have been a civil report. And what's happened here is this person's just taken a screenshot of, I'm assuming, a lecture slide and dumped it in like it was a figure. So it wasn't centered. It's the wrong size. It's in the wrong place. It's not the correct way of doing your equations at all, okay? So never screenshot an equation and put it in. Use the equation editor in Word. Do it properly, all right? That's never acceptable. Okay, getting towards the end here. Referencing formats. So a few things to notice about referencing. This is not IEEE to start with, so make sure you're referencing in the style you've been told to reference in, otherwise it won't be considered acceptable. So this is not IEEE. The reason why I actually put this particular one in is you remove your hyperlinks, okay? So don't leave, if you've referenced a web page, you don't leave in the hyperlink. You right-click, remove hyperlink, so it takes out all the blue text. It just sits there as black text. It's just the way that it's done, okay? Remember to remove all your hyperlinks within references. I don't know why, but it is. It's just how it's done. The other thing is, if you're referencing workshop slides, they're not a website. You shouldn't put the website in. You were told to reference them as though they were a report. So that's how you should have referenced them. The website actually had no place here. We spoke about this. I said I'd speak about it again, the same as before. So this is references. They are IEEE, which is good. Just remember to, and they have removed their hyperlinks, which is good. So like, there's a lot to like here. Just remember to check your font, okay? Check your font, check your spacing, make sure it's correct. Something that I like to do right as I get to the end in my very last sort of stages of proofreading. I know I tell you to use a package to help you do your references, and I'd still highly encourage that. But once I get to the point where all my references are in and I'm pretty much happy with them, I actually copy them, delete the automatic referencing system, and paste them in as plain text, just to stop anything updating at any stage when I don't want it to, and reverting all of these back to some other format. Spell people's names right. All right, cool. So I actually overall will say I was fairly impressed with the way most people referenced. You could clearly see when somebody made an attempt and then when somebody just didn't, or when somebody listened and somebody didn't. So, but most of you who did make the effort did really, really well. So I was quite impressed with that. Remember, for your next report, it's not IEEE referencing, it's APA referencing, which is different again. Okay, white space. So you didn't have a huge number of pages to play with in this report, right? So making use of the space that you had was really important in order to do well. This is a software report, and you can see 4 pages of it here. So I just zoomed out on my screen and took a screenshot of 4 pages. And this was probably hardest for the softwares more than anyone, because they have a lot of figures because they're on phones which are vertical aligned. So they get a lot of white space either side of most of their figures. And that's fairly unavoidable, unfortunately, for them. But there's a lot of white space in this document regardless. And you can see big bits of white space there, and there, and there, and there, and there, and there, and here. And here, huge amounts of white space, right? And that ends up really limiting how much content you can end up putting in your report. So this is a pagination step. Often, you generally don't realize that you're leaving so much white space whilst you're writing, and it's kind of something to finish writing and then come back to and go, okay, how can I compress this down? Do I actually need to leave, I think that's 2 enters, 2 carriage returns in there. Do I need to leave carriage returns between my paragraphs at all? Do I need to leave them between text and figures? And often the answer is no. Particularly if you've got a good system of headings, you probably don't need to leave these bits of white space virtually anywhere, okay? And so thinking about that a little bit will allow you to compress massively. And we had this conversation around the table of figures in that first PDF report we marked as well, where leaving huge amounts of white space really costs that person the ability to get marks. This is going to change kind of really drastically between Assessment 2 and Assessment 4, by the way. Assessment 2, you should have been really looking to condense. Assessment 4, you're going to have loads of white space, okay? And that's perfectly fine. You've got a totally different system of doing page layouts, and you're going to end up with a lot of pages that have got a little bit of text up the top and then nothing below them, and that's perfectly fine. I think this is basically it for talking about Assessment 2 then, because this was just one final last thing I wanted to point out is you don't need to ever reformat the title page, okay? I fully understand why people did, and I was like, you need to make everything size 12 and da-da-da-da-da, so they went and reformatted the title page. I don't care if you did, but you don't have to. You can just leave the title page exactly as it is and fill it out. Okay, so that's Assessment 2. I'm going to talk about Assessment 3 now. I was going to separate these into 2 different videos, but I think there's been so much cross-contamination that it actually makes sense to do them together. So I'm just going to plow on here. If you need to stop and take a break, stop listening to me for a while, that's fine. But Assessment 3, a lot of the marks, so the way in which Assessment 3 is broken up is there's 5 marks for the track changes and that, and then there's 5 marks for the marking and the peer review. So the marking and the peer review and the making your own marking rubric and stuff like that. Really, the marks were there for, did you do the thing? If you did what you were asked to do, in general, you were gifted marks in here. So did you fill out that table where you had to mark everybody? Well, sorry, you had to rank all of the 4 things that you were supposed to do. You had to then give them all a mark, and then you had to determine whether they were fair and comment on that. Did you do that? That was worth basically a mark. Did you put a couple of hours worth of effort into your marking rubric? Did it look like you'd spent an hour or 2 making up a really cool marking rubric that was going to cover everything, that was really clear when people lost and gained marks? If you did, you would have gotten the marks. If you just hacked something together that looked like it took 2 minutes, or looks like you copied mine and pasted it and then changed a few of the words around, you didn't necessarily lose all of the marks there, but you would have struggled to gain them. If you did have, and then did you leave useful comments? So if you had a really complex, good marking rubric, you would have gotten away with just a few extra comments if it was all really self-explanatory. If you had a very simple marking rubric, you really needed, I'm talking like a page of comments on each report then, in order to regain those marks from your very simple marking rubric. But either or, did you do the thing? And then, did you honestly reflect on your rubric before and after, and how you would have made a better rubric in the future? I don't care what your rubric was good at. I never care what your reports or your rubrics or whatever are good at. I only ever care what they're bad at. I ever care that you could look at these things at the end and go, okay, I could have done this better, this better, this better, and this better. That shows that you can grow and you can improve, right? So that's the only reason we ever reflect, is to look at things that, with which we could improve on. So did you look at it and go, oh, it actually wasn't as fair in this scenario as it could have been? And that was kind of it, right? So that's all I was really looking for in the first half. Did you do all the things I asked you to do? Did you have a decent go at it? If so, you probably got 3 or 4 at least out of 5, maybe 5 out of 5. So, a few things to pull apart here, though, that I saw as common issues. So here was a table that somebody used. They went through. They had student numbers in here. I just blanked them out because who cares? But you don't need them. They ranked their 4 reports, and then they marked them, and they determined whether they were fair. Now, the report they ranked as best got 9 out of 10. Great, fine. The report they ranked as worst got 6. But the report they ranked as second got 7, and the report they ranked as third got 7. And then they said this was fair, and this just does not compute, right? You said you thought this report was better than this one, and yet you gave them the same mark. So how on earth could that possibly be fair? Now, granted, for this particular person, they went through, they wrote a whole big chunk about this, and they talked about it, and they talked about how they believe, actually on reflection, that their first initial impression was the thing that was wrong. They got this ranking wrong, and they should have ranked them equally in the first place. But without that extended discussion, or without acknowledging that, yeah, there were some faults in my marking rubric, and yes, although this was a better report, it actually got punished unfairly for blah, 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 or whatever, there's no way that you should have had different rankings and had these not match up and then been able to say yes to them. Okay? It's just not. And you wouldn't have lost marks for saying no. Saying no was like a good thing. It acknowledged that you knew what you were doing. There's one other point that when people are asked to basically assess their rubric and say, you know, are these things fair or not? A really common response is, I use the same marking rubric for everybody, therefore it is fair. And that is totally, totally wrong. Okay, you cannot take that logic. Standard example. For a fair selection, everybody has to take the same exam. Please climb that tree. And, you know, here are your people taking the exam. The monkey's got to win, or the bird that can fly, possibly. Just because you use the same rubric and you set the same requirements out to everybody, they all had totally different projects, and that is in no way something that is fair. And this is something that traps people all the time, at all levels, and I fully expected it to trap people here. And I don't care. I'm not going to come after you for not having acknowledged this. This happens all over the place. But it is a misnomer to believe that just because everybody took the same assessment, then that it was a fair assessment. So some things that we can point out as to how this clearly wasn't an okay thing to say that one marking rubric was applicable across all disciplines. And just so you all know, you don't actually have the same marking rubric. I gave that one generic one out in the assessments, but every discipline actually molds that to make more sense for their own particular project, because one generic marking rubric was pretty much useless. Okay, so some things that were drastically different between projects. Workshop content in some cases, like the medical or the robot project or whatever, it was laboratory style classes, and it was highly related to your project, and it leads you by the hand, step by step through the content. It is as explicit as you could possibly ask for, and it is so unbelievably obviously related to the project. If you look at something like mechanical, though, totally different. Mechanicals and aeros was Sean standing out the front giving a lecture with a couple of pictures behind him where he sort of ranted for an hour and a half, and that was it. And some of it maybe was related to the project and lots of it wasn't. So covering what they learnt in the lab, they were in the workshop, with totally different styles and had totally different amount of relevance to the project. So that was one thing that was drastically different. Another thing that was drastically different, if you look at the mechanical project brief, there's a little bit of background to it first, but in reality, it's less than a page long. If you look at the robot project brief, it's 15 pages long. So if you wanted somebody to recap the project, in one case for mechanicals, it's, as we saw, you copy and paste and you're done. In somebody else for the robot project, well, that's like you couldn't have even fit it in the 10-page report in order to try to do it. So that's something that's just totally different and super not applicable to Mark the same way. So where this becomes difficult is if you end up with a really specific rubric that says, I want to see this, and I want to see this, and I want to see this, and then you get either a project that doesn't fit, or you get a person who doesn't fit. And if we think back to the start of this video, again, this the PDF submission, it was missing lots and lots of things that were in my rubric. And I wouldn't have said my rubric was overly specific, but it was too specific for that particular person. And according to my rubric, they would have failed and failed hard. So as you get specific, you limit the ability for somebody to do things in an intelligent way that you didn't think of. So it hurts different projects and it hurts different approaches. They might be equally valid approaches, but your rubric didn't reflect it. That can then lead to the tendency to get these really, really generic marking rubrics. And that was, the marking rubric that actually went out with assessment 2 was super generic, right? And once you get a rubric that is that generic, it's entirely subjective. It basically just becomes, did the marker like it or not? And there's not really any more to it than that. So I've got an example here, and I want to restate this. This is not overall a bad rubric, and I would see worse rubrics than this be used in industry and stuff, or to assess grants and to assess students and stuff like that all the time. So this is not a bad rubric, but I'm going to go after this pretty aggressively, okay? Not in order to highlight things that I think are specifically wrong with this rubric, just wrong with rubrics in general. So straight up we get some buzzwords in here that you see them used all the time, and they're not actually particularly useful. So this criteria has taken a bunch, this marking criteria has a bunch of areas that it's going to assess, and then it's going to categorize them into how well they were done. So introduces the topic and project. Introduction provides little to no information, some information, informative information, or extremely informative information. I mean, all information is informative, but okay. Whether something is extremely informative or little to no information is pretty much entirely subjective. And I see this a lot, particularly considering I asked you all to go and assess your own assessment 2s, and a bunch of people went in and wrote on their introductions, oh, this is a really good introduction, thinking it was extremely informative. And I'm reading it going, this is terrible. You've missed this, it's awful, I hate everything about it. So it's exactly the same content, two different people interpreting it differently. So it looks like this should be really good and really well broken up and really clear as to where you would sit in here, but it's entirely subjective. And so that's kind of dangerous, right? The other one is understanding, using the word understanding. So I'm going to separate myself here from my opinion, from advice I've been given. Talking to people who sit within the teaching and learning parts of higher education and stuff like that, they all hate the word understanding because it's not measurable. You can't measure somebody's understanding of something. If you want to get that, you have to ask them to do a specific thing, and then you're only measuring that specific thing. And so they say you should never ever use the word understanding in a criteria or in a course outline or anything like that. I love the word understanding, and I think it's great, and I think that's the only thing we should ever be trying to teach is understanding. But it's another one of these things that apparently it's immeasurable, and so it's subjective, and so it has no place in a rubric. So yeah, all of this is actually subjective. Now, if we get down to here, we actually see that they now have a crack at putting in some details. So introduces relevant information and concepts in an extremely accessible way. Provides great So extremely and great examples. Like both of these are subjective terms, but examples, definitions, appropriate images, and equations. So that's kind of cool. That's some good details that would actually be fairly useful. Report is extremely well structured in a logical and chronological way. Chronological is not logical. So this is where your details can be really, really, really limiting to somebody. Putting stuff out in a chronological way is often a terrible way to communicate information. Setting these things out week 1, week 2, week 3 is often really, really bad. So setting them out chronologically is terrible. So a logical way and a chronological way are often directly in contrast with each other. So would have somebody suffered if they laid something out in a really, really logical way, but it definitely wasn't chronological? Well, according to the format, they would have. So, as you'll notice here, I just picked on the same rubric from both directions. There's no way to avoid criticism here. Don't worry. I overall think that this was a reasonably good rubric. So, this person wouldn't have been marked badly for it. It's just, I wanted to hold this discussion with you so that you could maybe understand what it's like to be a marker a little bit more. One thing that I definitely don't like about this rubric is that all the categories are created equal. So every one gets marked out of 10. And so the report structure and appropriate formatting is just as important as understanding of the content. And that's just as important as an introduction. And I wouldn't say that all 4 of these categories are necessarily created equal. I would say some of them are far more important than others. Maybe this person believed that they were all the same, but in general, I would say they're not, and they shouldn't all be ranked the same. They should either have a scaling factor put on them, or you'll see a lot of people go, this can only be award you marks up to 3 or 5 or something like that. Another thing that's ambiguous here is what's the difference between an 8 and a 10? Is that entirely subjective based on just, I don't know, what the marker decided they would put in there? So, yeah, marking ranges can be a little bit tricky as well. So why I kind of went on my rant, what I want to highlight here is there is a growing tendency for students to want to learn only based on what's written in a rubric, and it's a really bad way to try to learn. Rubrics are good things to refer to. They're great things to use as, here's a checklist, have I done everything at the end? But trying to learn things only because they are or are not in a rubric is a really, really rough way to try to learn content. Don't look for rubrics early. Maybe look for them at the end, or maybe read them briefly early and go, okay, I roughly know what's going on here. But yeah, learning based solely on a rubric, it causes you to miss really important content all the time. So don't do it. If I could, I would never show a marking rubric to a student ever. And all of the data that I've collected over the last 4 years strongly implies, because I've done this, I've given very detailed rubrics, I've given no rubrics, I've given very open rubrics. The less information you give students in a rubric, the better they do in an assessment. That's not the overall opinion of people from within teaching and learning. It's simply what the data that I have collected, which I haven't done statistical analysis on or any of that stuff, it's just what that data is saying. So yeah, don't work to a rubric, just learn the content. All right, this was another interesting point that just came up. So somebody made this comment when they were reflecting on their own rubric. I started to realize that there were some aspects that I definitely could have changed in regards to the marking rubric. Cool. Being that it was out of 10, it was hard to give students in between marks or be able to have an extensive marking rubric where multiple points are addressed in the same criteria line. This meant that giving marks to other students, I had to either give them 1 mark or 2 marks, depending on which I felt was appropriate. This is interesting. So this particular person has decided that if it's out of 10, you get the mark or you don't. They're not doing halves, they're not doing quarters. You get the mark or you don't. And you will find that there's a whole heap of stuff out there where this is in fact the case. things are considered satisfactory or unsatisfactory, and there's no real leeway in between that. So this can mean that very, very small changes sometimes can end up having drastic effects on a full outcome. If you fell just short, you could have very easily lost a whole heap of marks in a report, whereas just over the line could have ended up with two people who were very, very similar in the quality of the thing that they submitted, but they ended up getting drastically different marks. So it's an interesting observation, and it can be the 1% every now and then that end up making huge differences in the end, where you feel just satisfactory or just unsatisfactory. I'm generally pretty happy. I give out half marks, and then if I generally would try and mark something out of 10 to within a half mark. And if I'm umming and ahhing to myself as to whether they should get a half mark or they shouldn't, I give them a quarter of a mark and I move on. But I don't try and mark to any higher level of fidelity than that. But some people do try and mark to the 0.1 of a mark or even less sometimes, which it can produce some interesting results. Okay, this is it. Last slide. We're basically done. Positive and negative feedback. So this is partially in here to relate to the way in which people provided comments on reports. So I was expecting, in order for when you did your peer review stuff, that that you would have had comments and you would have had track changes. So whenever anybody made a typo, or they hadn't centered a figure, or they text wrapped, or they hadn't used a caption, you would have gone in, you would have actually fixed all of that within their report. So they could have just printed it and it would have looked perfect. You use then comments to go, hey, look, you're repeating content that you'd said a couple of pages ago, or overall, I fixed up your introduction here, but it's still lackluster and it's missing da-da-da-da-da. So you are expected to have, as was demonstrated in the assessment outline, both comments and actual changes in the report. Basically, if I went through and I marked up this document, and I made all the same changes you made, you would have gotten 5 out of 5. If you missed a bunch of things, you would have lost some marks. If you used only comments or only track changes, you would have lost marks as well. Again, there was a fairly rigorous set out to this, but I know a lot of people didn't use that when they marked because they felt it was a little bit harsh. So they just kind of massaged it a little bit to be a bit nicer to you. All right. So on giving people feedback. This is something that we will actually talk about in week 8 or week 9 in the lecture content. There's a few slides around it in general, but considering you had to give feedback to people, let's talk about it a little bit here. Positive and negative feedback. Predominantly, if you're going to give somebody feedback and it's going to be critical, which most feedback in this world generally is, if you don't make an attempt to provide constructive criticism, i.e., this is the thing that I don't think you're doing well, and here is how I suggest you doing it better, then you're not providing feedback, you're whinging. That's essentially what it is, okay? You've got to only ever provide feedback when making an attempt to help somebody. Otherwise, shut up, keep it to yourself, right? So, and yeah, I fully understand that there's a lot of times when people want to provide critical feedback, but just saying, that sucks isn't useful. That sucks because blah, 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 because this video was way too long and the relevant information was way too dilute. You should have done it as a document. Okay, cool, great. Now I know how to do it better next time. But yeah, just hitting people with that's bad or that's wrong doesn't help them improve. What you want to do, particularly when you are providing criticism and negative feedback, is highlighting the exact areas. All right here, this is the thing that's not good. And this is the way to do it better. Rather than your intro sucks, -2. That's not useful. All right, cool. And the other side of it is heaping praise on people doesn't really help them improve. Saying, oh, this is really good when it's not really good is actually doing more harm than good to somebody. So constant positive feedback, it helps with motivation, and motivation is fundamentally important. So if all you're ever doing is beating somebody down with negative feedback, you're going to unmotivate them, and then they're no longer going to improve. So you need to balance. You need to find, hey, these are the things that you're doing well, but here are the areas that you can focus on. But if something's not good, you do not want to give it positive feedback, because it's going to tell the person, there's nothing wrong with this, don't change it, leave it. And then it's just going to sit there and fester forever as a thing that's actually a negative. But a really, really important reason to give some positive feedback is if they've done anything good, you definitely want to highlight that and say, don't change this, this is excellent. Change all the stuff around it. Okay? So trying to balance positive and negative feedback can be difficult. You don't want to go excessively either one way or the other. And if you are ever going to provide negative feedback, make sure you find a way to make it be constructive or keep it to yourself. Okay? Other than that, I think, yep, that finishes it. So I don't actually know how long this video ended up being. I know it's probably quite long though. I hope it's useful to you. I've never tried to make this type of content ever before. So I'll continue trying to do it in the future, because I know at the moment we struggle to get feedback to you. Again, give me some feedback on it if you think there's things that I'd be able to do better next time around. All right. Thanks, guys.